The French theorists Deleuze and Guattari recommend that experimentation is an alternative to interpretation, an act, the outcome of which is unknown. Thought I would use my artistic license tonight to conduct a somewhat postmodern experiment on you, which is in keeping with my topic. I have slides and a written text, and I'm not going to explain the correlation between the two or mention the slides at all. The slides are a selection of some very contemporary feminist art, some art by women who are not or were not feminists, some work by African Americans, a couple of medieval and Victorian works, and some art by insane people. I will reveal them in answering every question, and I hope this isn't irritating for you, but the subject of my talk regard to how minorities and women. Jacques Derrida recently curated reading the art. Readers would not be blind to the text on display. Derrida exhibits to a very, it's a mind-boggling, even perhaps absurd. First obstacle to interpretation is read early and time closely and just to the a connection with world history of our world. Enormous in this enemy, but causes are the very thing that makes it the modes of representation. These very are the means of subvert power. Using Kafka as their main example, incorrect and like multiplicity, which allow minority writers to use by the minor and major called deliberate attempt process, including deterritorialized for minorities who want to pursue it. One thinks particularly in this who is a Mayan, have always hidden to herself. That is why we normally must hide, some to preserve her in all colors. Susan Guattari asks, live today in a language more even know that time must use as well as to link. Kafka's apparent success in deferring to Susan Guattari, the writer, apart from the situation makes him all more the force and another sensibility. End quote. Joyce Carey, the situation of women, lately darker tone. Quote, being so ghetto until the woman writer, so after all, is a place in which to live, down and she altogether. The position of women visual artists is perhaps all the more intense because women have been and are the bodies of the patriarchal gaze. So women find that which is closed to us. I want to read a somewhat lengthy passage from Joyce Carey. Her comments address all women's art, visual. First, there are women writers. There are not and have never been men writers. This is an empty category. A class without the very verb writing always implies masculinity. Hence, the double-edged praise that befalls the woman writer and that she writes like a man. Which man, I always ask, does find herself, and the usage is deliberate. She does not will or wish, but is found. That is her birthright for life. Women can't. So Louis Briscoe of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse has been hypnotized by male authority against which she, like Woolf, must struggle. Language conceals an invisible adversary, says Helene Sissou, because it is the language of men. Of course, not all women are despised by men, at least not all the time. But it is a commonplace dilemma that a man's quarrel with the feminine in his own nature will be a quarrel with women. One need not consider the misogyny of the ages. For one thing, it is too familiar and too depressing. This example is close at hand, is well-intentioned, literary. End quote. The same about discrimination and exclusion, then outright hostility and reductive interpretation. With female sexual imagery in the 60s, the cry against them was so intense, it still affects some women artists today who feel compelled to examine their imagery for anything suggestive of female imagery, and who censor their aesthetic. We can't do anything right. We can't do anything without being further despised. Joyce Groves also has a poem called The Luxury of Being Despised. We are either imitating men, the word is derivative, or we are scorned as decorative or narcissistic. Lucy Lepore wrote in the 70s about the controversy over female imagery. Quote, when private expression is exposed to public interpretation, a certain amount of dislocation inevitably results. This is all true of art based on women's sexuality, which has traditionally been forbidden and devalued subject matter. Since artists learn from communicating with their audiences, the damage done to women unable to exhibit, teach, find role models in history, participate and communicate in the art world becomes particularly devastating. End quote. She goes on to say that cultural assumptions about women help explain why women choosing to depict their own sexual experience would have been considered in dangerous opposition to high art. And the threat still persists today. There's a New York art artist named Steve Janikos whose works appear in the art magazines, in the most recent one, as a matter of fact. He was interviewed by the Village Voice in 1980 after he exhibited a racist painting because he was angry about black artists protesting. The black artists were protesting a white artist show called Nigger Drawings. And Janikos came up with this really horrible painting, which I won't describe here. And he was quoted as saying, a bunch of blacks tried to take advantage of a situation so that they could start to show. I don't think people won't show blacks because they're black, but because they don't do interesting work. It has nothing to do with color. It's like women. Women happen to be inferior artists to men, and it's the same with blacks. They happen to be better at peddling dope. Maybe that's their talent. I mean, why should blacks be good at art? Another instance of the problem is closer to home. Upstairs, we now have an international exhibit of Latin American women artists and folk artists. It's a beautiful show and an intriguing glimpse, really, into a variety of women's work from 10 countries, and was curated by Betty LeDuc for educational bridge building purposes. We're really lucky to have it here, and we've had very positive responses. Although it is not in any way a feminist exhibit, we were criticized by someone who hadn't seen the show, who accused us of imposing our political agenda on the Missoula public. I don't know why I was surprised at this, but it desperately points to the problem I'm talking about. Anything by a woman is shown, it's still somehow threatening. And secondly, the exclusion of women is not perceived as a political agenda. That is what is normal. And to exhibit women's art is still considered aberrant. Amazing but true. So, is it comic relief here? So is it any wonder that women are driven to speak in code, to avoid or refuse interpretation, or in some cases to refuse to be visible at all? Germaine Greer, in her book The Obstacle Race, discusses a different aesthetic medium popular with many women, which is called primitive or naive art. She says, women, by virtue of their inability to plunge into the mainstream, are often genuine primitives, even when they have had a modicum of training. Their attraction to conventional forms of faux naivete is another aspect of the timidity of oppressed peoples. Moreover, the imagery of faux naivete is most often the imagery of paradisiacal domesticity, which women have been brought up to revere. Each faux naive painting shows a place for everything and everything in its place, usually confined by a linear outline, as if painting were a version of good housekeeping. It is small wonder that women with decorative and graphic talent choose this guaranteed popular form in which to avoid revealing themselves. And now I have to mention one of my original inspirations for this topic, the novel, a Victorian novel, Black Beauty, written in 1877 by Anna Sewell. I suppose many of you have read it. Anna Sewell described her novel as the autobiography of a horse. But it is actually, Whitney Chadwick explains, quote, in fact, a feminist tract deploring the cruel oppression of all creatures, especially women in the working class. Black Beauty is both a working animal at the mercy of owners who range from kind to cruel, and a beautiful piece of property, like a wife. The novel was immensely popular, partly because many Britons had come to realize that the animal rights issue was really also a human rights issue. End quote. Why did Anna Sewell choose to write in code? She would have received a far different response if she had not disguised her message. Chadwick also reminds us that Victorian pornography also made the equation between women and horses, with the vocabulary of women being broken to the bit, saddled, bridled, and whipped into submission. And that was the time when gynecologists first used the term stirrups for those dreaded footrests. The identification of women in nature is often used by the patriarchy to deprecate or sentimentalize both in the false dualism of nature versus culture. But many women artists have used such imagery to celebrate the identification, and perhaps, like Sewell's Black Beauty, to call attention to our common plight. There are as many styles in women's art as in men's, but I have been looking for instances where aesthetic choices are determined by a refusal to be available to patriarchal representation and interpretation. Along with the now stereotyped styles of sexual imagery, organic forms, and experiments in formal relationships between interior and exterior, all of which are labeled female art, except when men do them. There was a popular trend in the 60s and 70s of women and men, but more women, using what Lucy Lepard nicknamed the grid, geometric or organic repetitions of line, color, shape, or image, reflecting a self-consciously obsessive repetition or pattern. I have been unable to find an adequate account of this widespread trend amongst women, just as I have also never read an adequate account of indigenous women's geometric weavings and paintings. It has occurred to me that something important is going on here if everyone is rendered speechless. Lately, as part of my job and for my own interest, I've been doing some research in the field of art therapy, which I won't go into much here because it's very complicated. But in my readings so far, I've run across some formal analysis and examples of art by so-called insane people, schizophrenic and psychotic, which resemble and have given me insight into some of the women's art I've been showing you here. I'm hesitant to even bring this up because I risk invoking the prejudice against women and insane people, both of which groups are similarly despised and feared. The representation of madness in this culture is a construction based on another false dualism of sanity and insanity, and thus a corollary of the other false dualisms kept firmly in place in spite of the efforts of many post-Freudian theorists like Argylang and Foucault to demystify the cultural dynamics which have made mental illness a prison and sanctuary for difference. The white male art world has historically taken up with madness in an exploitive manner during times like our own, when the closed system they have created for themselves becomes exhausted and they must look outside to the margins for authenticity, for inspiration. The aesthetic colonization of insane art resembles the appropriation of non-Western formalism, which has periodically rejuvenated Western art, as in the case of Cubism. So the parallel I am suggesting here tentatively is not one of appropriation, but resemblance in sensibility. I think the oppression of women is so thorough and so deeply disabling that I often marvel we are able to function at all. And I am no longer surprised at the craziness I see in myself and other women who are not completely hypnotized. We live in constant physical terror of male violence. We internalize from birth the fact that we are second rate, and we must constantly prove ourselves worthy in a culture that has contempt for the feminine. So when I read descriptions of the art of the insane as expressing rigidity or abandon, or raw aggression which cannot be acted out, or obsessive repetition of familiar patterns, all of which are nonverbal, fragile defenses against a threatening environment. And when I see similar formal patterns in the art of schizophrenics, I cannot help but feel a tug of empathetic understanding. So, as an inconclusive conclusion, I've been suggesting some parallels between some women's art and the art of other outsiders in our culture as an attempt to affirm and instigate communication amongst the oppressed in defiance and resistance to patriarchal interpretation. If this outsider community is sufficiently unintelligible to the patriarchy, perhaps the outsider artists can, as Deleuze and Guattari suggest, force the means for another consciousness and another sensibility. That's it. And I'd like to thank Monica Bauer for loaning me tons of books, and Jeff Sutton for helping out with the slides. And I'd be happy to answer any questions and tell you whose images you were looking at. Did anyone recognize? Yeah.
I wondered about that blue picture of the woman or something. You were talking about birth parallel.
Uh-huh. What? Can you describe it again? I didn't hear.
Well, it was a face in a blue background, just kind of lying there. And we were talking about Joseph.
Okay, let me check. Can somebody get the lights? Yeah, but I'll find it. I'll find it. I could use some light though. Just turn number 7 on. That one? Okay. Okay. That one. Okay, this is Howardina Pindell. Howardina Pindell, she's an African-American artist, and this is an autobiographical piece. For example, that white shape in the lower left corner is the slave ship that brought her ancestors over. And I really like it because of all the fragmentation and the transparency of her body. And she painted her face white. So there's a lot going on in there. Pindell. Mm-hmm. And also, I told you about Steve Janikos and his racist comments. This artist, Howardina Pindell, was the one who had organized the protests against the racist show. So she's really fantastic. Yeah. Were there any others? I can read some of the names of the artists. The first one? The very first one? Yeah, the word pictures are by Barbara Kruger, who is also pretty incredible. Let's see. And she's interesting because she has almost abandoned the image altogether for reasons that I've brought up tonight. The image cannot defend itself. That's what Socrates said about words, but she combines images, like you probably can see that's the flag there, and she is just really brilliant at, I have a quote here from Kate Linker, that Barbara Kruger reveals the obscene privilege of male authority and works to disrupt the masculine pleasures of voyeurism. She's pretty radical.
There's much made of her background as a graphic designer for Shaun Gant, and I think it was just an attempt to refocus the audience from the message in her work, which is really not.
Yeah. And this is, thanks to Monica, this is Adolf Wölfli, a Swiss schizophrenic. His dates are 1864 to 1930. He was institutionalized most of his life, and I showed you about 6 or 7 of his works. And he was discovered by a psychoanalyst who was kind of ahead of his time, I guess, but who actually looked at his work in aesthetic terms. And yeah, while he was still alive, and provided him with materials. And another crazy person and this is really interesting. Let's see if I can find her. Oops. Okay, this is Yayoi Kusama, a Japanese artist. And this, I showed you several of hers too. She's the one that does the really obsessive looking patterns. This one, I want to point out, predates Andy Warhol. I have to say that because I always hear that women are derivative of men, and this is one of those examples of, one of the many examples. But she resides in a mental institution. Let's see, this is one of hers. She's there by choice, and it's not really clear whether she is insane or not. She's in her 50s now, and she was really at the forefront of the European and American art scene in the early 60s. This is hers. And this one, I like this one. Yeah, these are all hers. This one is hers too. That one, they're mostly, this one is pastel and watercolor on some kind of paper, it didn't say. And I also showed you Native American artist Jane Ash Poitras, who's Cree, a Hopi woman, Ramona Sakiastua, the African American artist Clarissa Sly, Carrie Mae Weems, and you may have recognized Georgia O'Keeffe, Judy Chicago, Frida Kahlo. The sculpture was by Harriet Hosmer, and there's a story behind that. Cynthia Carlson, Lee Krasner, Pat Stein, Sofonisba Anguissola. I gotta show you this one, 'cause it's really great. This was by the Native American woman, and she was adopted and taken away from her culture. So this one really speaks to me a lot. There, this one is by Sofonisba Anguissola, an Italian painter of the 1500s, and I like this one because if you think of it being painted by a woman, it's like a postmodern work of catching the voyeuristic male gaze, and look where his hand is positioned, and yet she is the painter, painting herself being painted. So I thought it was a really unique self-portrait. And the men's works that I showed you, besides Adolf Wöfle, were the Mondrian, his was one of the grids, and then the misogynist paintings by de Kooning and Kees van Dongen, when I was talking about Joyce Carol Oates. Are there any other questions or comments? Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo is becoming quite the rage. I wish I had more of her paintings to show. It's a long story. She's Mexican. Madonna just bought one of her paintings. I wish I had a slide of that. She bought My Birth of herself being born. Let's see. Yeah, this is Adrienne Piper. Sorry, I forgot to mention her. She's a performance artist. Carrie made memes. Get that one. I like that one a lot too. Let's see, where's Black Beauty? Oh, this woman here, Seraphine Louis, Monica told me about her too. She ended up in an insane asylum. She was a shepherdess and then a cleaning woman in France, and was discovered by some guy who visited the house she was cleaning. And then he kind of dumped her during the Depression. Her dates are almost exactly the same as Bowley's, 1864 to 1940 something. And she actually had a brief art career and then became completely forgotten. Frida did, just apparently hundreds of self-portraits, and in many of them depicted herself with animals. And she lived in excruciating physical pain from an accident she had been in when she was 18. She had innumerable operations. And she was married to Diego Rivera, who was abusive to her. And she just has been kind of rediscovered in the last 10 years and has become a cult figure of sorts. Let's see, I guess that was all I had of hers. This is by Margaret, age 7, one of the patients in therapy. One reason I'm looking into art therapy is that with this art school, I've been seeing hundreds of children's works, and things like this do crop up. And I want to have more of an understanding of if that's possible through art therapeutic forms of analysis of looking at children's art. And also, we're going to be giving an exhibit here of developmentally disabled artists next year. So, that's Mondrian. I kind of slipped some of the men's work in there just to see if anyone would notice the difference. Thanks for being so receptive. The ledger page, that was Vosley, the insane person, yeah. It's hard to tell, isn't it?
You have to use as many techniques as possible.
Right. Well, we should have those people eating their dinner in the mirror. You should get this. I mean, is this proper museum behavior?
I think that would be a good shot. See them.
Oh, in the mirror, yeah.